I want to show you what it means for someone to be ideologically possessed.
What is your next set of predictions?
Well, I would say we are headed for a collision course with history. I mean, we're really staring at many scenarios that end in some kind of civil war.
Well, you're one of the first people that's sounding an alarm, that there's a real issue with controlling people. There's a real issue with controlling dialogue, controlling the way people communicate, and that these ideologies, although seemingly innocuous, they can take you down very dangerous roads.
Seemingly innocuous ideology. Those words, innocuous ideology, those words do not go together. There are no innocuous ideologies. The advantage to me being an ideologue is that I can explain everything. I can feel morally superior, and I know who my enemies are. And you know what you're supposed to do with enemies. So I want to tell you about a book today. The book is called The Gulag Archipelago. You ready? The book is called The Gulag Archipelago, and it's by a Russian author, a Soviet author named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was in the Gulag Archipelago concentration camp system for a very long time. He had a very hard life. He was on the Russian front when the Germans invaded, and Solzhenitsyn was a soldier on the Russian front. And he wrote some letters to one of his friends, which were intercepted, complaining about the lack of preparation and using bitter, dark humor to describe the situation. And the consequences of that was that he was thrown into a work camp. The Soviet system relied on work camps, and so those were large labor camps of people who were essentially enslaved, many of whom were worked to death, often froze to death, working in conditions that were so dreadful that they're virtually unimaginable. It's necessary to analyze the relationship between the psychological integrity of the individuals within a society and the propensity of that society to engage in, say, acts of mass atrocity, or to go completely off the rails and then to engage in acts of mass atrocity. And so it was Frankl's contention, and also Solzhenitsyn's contention, that the fundamental linkage between the pathology and the state, the pathology of the state and the individual, was the individual's propensity to deceive him or herself, and to fail to act in an authentic manner, in a genuine and authentic manner, and to become, as a consequence, either nihilistic, let's say, or because of the incremental weakening of character that's part and parcel of adopting an inauthentic mode of being, or to turn to ideological and totalitarian solutions as an alternative to living appropriately and with responsibility as an individual. So Solzhenitsyn in particular laid at the feet of the Soviet citizenry the burden of the absolute catastrophes that characterized that system because of each individual's propensity or proclivity within the state to lie and deceive constantly about what they thought and what they said, and to be afraid to speak, and to be afraid to think, and to be afraid to criticize. And it was no wonder, because criticism, of course, was at least became an offense that was punishable by death. But these things start much more slowly than that. And they start with people abandoning their own identities and adopting a pathological group identity, well, for any number of reasons, but one of them certainly is their desire to shrink from individual responsibility and their desire for ready-made ideological solutions. And their desire for ready-made ideological solutions.
One's not answering. Yo, there's a police car right there. Tell the police he's right there. Tell him to call. Hello? I know you got the call. I'm an I-5 Yale.
And they start with people abandoning their own identities and adopting a pathological group identity, well, for any number of reasons, but one of them certainly is their desire to shrink from individual responsibility and their desire for ready-made ideological solutions.
Occupy then morphed into an anarchist movement that was just simply hostile to civilization, and it became absurd. And so when I say this is Occupy 2.0, this is the anarchist version of Occupy that has now reemerged, and it has fused with Black Lives Matter, which, as I've said lots of different places, if Black Lives Matter just simply meant what those words imply, I'd be on board with it. It doesn't. It means a great deal more than that, and we're beginning to see that in the last couple of weeks, too.
What else do you think it means?
Well, let's put it this way. For some reason, it means abolish the police, which is possibly the stupidest proposal I have ever heard. Why are you seeing something that looks like a communist revolution beginning in the streets? For the natural reason, which is that people are feeling excluded from their share, and they are being excluded. But this revolution that is beginning in our streets is no more coherent or desirable than Maoism, and it's going to be brutal in the Maoist way, or possibly the way that it unfolded in the French Revolution, or maybe it'll be some unique version and it'll get its own name. But if we want the Republic to survive, we're going to have to prevent this from happening. I'm sitting there in this room with several hundred other people, and I can, in my mind, almost count the people in the room who understand that something terrible is afoot. I knew that there was, I hesitate to say it, but there was a dean in the room who I knew wasn't going to say anything, but he knew how wrong this was. And so there's a way in which there's a sea of people engaged in a shared delusion, and then there's a few people witnessing the delusion and isolated, unable to exchange words or anything. That sense of being alone in a crowd is profound, and that really was how that meeting felt.
And in a crowd of people who are supposed to be your colleagues.
Yeah, who are sleepwalking.
One of the things that's quite interesting about the Gulag camps, and this is something that's very relevant to understanding of modern Russia, is that so ordinary criminals were put into the camps, and so were political prisoners. But the ordinary criminals, and so those would be rapists and murderers, let's say, as well as thieves who were engaged in theft as an occupation, those were regarded by the Soviets as socially friendly elements. And the reason for that was that they assumed that the reason that these people had turned to crime was because of the oppressive nature of the previous czarist/capitalist system, and that the only reason that these criminals existed was because they had been oppressed. They were oppressed victims of that system. And so one of the convenient consequences of that absolutely insane doctrine was that the Soviets put the ordinary criminals in charge of the camps. And these were very, very seriously bad people. And so you can imagine the way that they treated the political prisoners, who were regarded as socially hostile elements, sometimes because of their own hypothetically traitorous acts, but more often merely as a consequence of their racial or ethnic identity, or the fact that they were related by birth to, say, people who had been successful under the previous system, so who had any association with nobility or any association with what were known as the kulaks, who were the only successful class of former peasants in the Soviet Union, because they were regarded as privileged. You may have heard that word more recently. They were regarded as privileged and therefore as enemies of the state, and it didn't matter if it was your father or your grandfather or your great-grandfather who happened to be privileged, but the mere fact that you were a member of that group was sufficient reason to put you into a camp. And we're talking hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of people who underwent that fate. And so the idea in the Soviet Union was, just because you were the member of a class, even as a consequence of your familial association, you were immediately sufficiently guilty to be put into a camp and punished. So the Soviets really implemented and perfected the idea of class and ethnicity-based guilt. And it's a very bad road to walk down, and it's something that we're very much engaged in at the moment, because there's discussion everywhere in North America now about the idea of, well, race-predicated guilt, for example, and ethnic-predicated guilt. And it's a very bad idea to classify an entire group of people as guilty of anything based on their group membership.
Structural, institutionalized inequality or racism, right? So an anti-racist frame understands racism as a system. While individual players partake in it, it's not dependent on individual players, right? It's embedded in the fabric of the society, in all the institutions, the norms, the practices, the policies, the way that history is told, and it functions to ensure an unequal distribution of basically everything between people of color as a whole and white people as a whole.
And I refuse to let whiteness consume me. And I'm going to say that word explicitly, whiteness. I refuse. I refuse for my mother. I refuse for her mother, for my grandfather, for my ancestors, for my brothers and sisters, my relatives today. I refuse.
I can't emphasize this enough. This is not useful. Just get rid of it. It is not possible to avoid being socialized into a racist worldview if you're white. It's not possible. It's coming at us 24/7. The only way to resist it is to be able to see it and think it through. So to deny it is not going to help you.
I encourage you to look them up as well. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. Their actions were initially to throw a heavy weight and a bottle at cops. So I offer 3 very different strategies, right? One is political organizing. Another one is non-traditional, maybe, more resistance, more violent kind of action.
Race-predicated guilt, for example, and ethnic-predicated guilt. And it's a very bad idea to classify an entire group of people as guilty of anything based on their group membership. So these sorts of things are things we haven't yet learned, and certainly should have.
Do you think that it's fair to say all white people in this country have white privilege?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Do all white people have white privilege?
Yes.
I feel myself having it every day.
The country is founded on white supremacy, and that persists today.
Hyper aware, feel super guilty all the time.
But that white people in this country generally are prejudiced?
I'd go further and say we're all racist.
Is it fair to say that all white people are racist throughout the country?
Yes, absolutely.
Not just the South?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes it's okay to be like, oh, all white people do this, or white people are X, and especially in a negative light.
Is it wrong to judge people collectively?
Yes.
Is it wrong to judge people collectively?
It's wrong to judge everyone collectively, you know?
Duh.
Yeah, absolutely. No one's a monolith.
That's wrong to judge people collectively, right?
To judge people? Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously. Tell me about some of the white privileges that you have encountered over the past, let's say today.
You're talking about me as a white man today?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. I mean, I don't know if I could give you examples.
Not really today, but maybe. Sorry, I'm not good at thinking.
Like today, what white privilege have you come across?
I sat in my room until 12:30 this morning.
What are some of the white privilege things you came across, let's say today?
Today?
Yeah.
I mean, just being in the world.
Is it fair to say that on a daily basis, black people around this country face obstacles because of white privilege?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
White supremacy as an institution punishes black folk in a way.
Daily.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Every day.
How black people are consumed with this day to day, and they deal with this issue day to day.
Oh, 100%.
I mean, I think that's just so obvious that if you're not admitting that, you're blinding yourself to reality.
Are you a professor?
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense now.
In fact, when we go to the airport, I walk with her. My wife's black, so I'll have my hand on her so that people see that I'm with her. I extend my white privilege over to her.
Now I'm here in Harlem in front of the Jackie Robinson Housing Projects to ask residents what they think of white privilege. Do you know what the concept of white privilege is?
The concept of white privileges.
Yeah. You ever hear that?
I've heard of it, but I don't think about it.
When you wake up in the morning, do you immediately think about and are consumed with the idea of white privilege?
No.
You don't think about that all day long, every day? No?
No, I'm not consumed with it at all.
I teach students I'm not consumed with anything except for runny noses and pencils.
My mom didn't raise me to view color as the object of anything.
Do you wake up every day thinking, I am not going to succeed today because of white privilege?
No, obviously not. You see, I'm my own businessman.
Would you even think it's damaging to tell your kids and teach your kids, if you're a black kid, that you're not going to succeed in life because you have
Of course.
privilege?
Of course. It makes them think, okay, well, I'm going to be nothing. If I want to be a doctor, I can't even do that anymore. It gives them no hope.
Color ain't stopped nothing. I mean, it's a myth.
It's America. If you're willing to put forth an effort, you'll do what you got to do.
I got kids in here, man, that's lawyers, doctors. They grew up out of this building.
I know it sounds cliche, but I can accomplish anything.
If you let something stop you, then that's you. Me, I ain't let nothing stop me.
My daughter is graduating at the top of her class.
One of the most awful elements of it, I think, is the idea that individuals should be defined in terms of their group identity at all. I mean, you could argue, and this is one of these weird inversions that's so characteristic of this chaotic state that we're in, when people originally started fighting against unfair discrimination, and I say unfair discrimination because lots of discrimination is fair. If you discriminate against people on the basis of their competence, that's perfectly reasonable. It's unfair discrimination that constitutes the proper battleground for people who have a more egalitarian viewpoint. But the initial idea was to eliminate the proclivity for people to be categorized according to their group identity, because that was interfering with everyone's ability to view them as competent individuals. But that got flipped probably in the 70s after the Soviet state so self-evidently was revealed as a catastrophe. That got flipped so that the world was turned into one group against another, power struggle from one group against another, and then the social justice warrior types and the lefties, even the Democratic Party, started categorizing everybody according to their ethnic or sexual or racial identity and made that the canonical element of their being. And that's an absolutely terrible thing to do. It leads to, in the Soviet Union, when that happened, for example, when they introduced that idea along with the notion of class guilt. So, for example, when the Soviets collectivized the farms, they pretty much wiped out or raped and froze to death all of their competent farmers. They called them kulaks, and they attributed class guilt to them because they were successful peasants, and they defined their success as oppression and theft. They killed all of them, pretty much, shipped them off to Siberia and froze them to death, and they were the productive agriculturalists in the Soviet Union. And then in the 1930s in the Ukraine, because of that, about 6 million Ukrainians starved to death. But the Soviets were big on collective guilt. And all of these things that you hear about now, like white privilege, for example, they're variants of collective guilt. I pick your bloody identity, whatever it happens to be, and then I make you a guilty member of that category, and then you and the rest of the guilty members of that category are judged as a unit. It's absolutely, it's murderous pushed to its extreme. And we've seen that many, many times. Mention to have that immediately attributed to their oppression.
Yes.
And it's not obvious that that's something we want to do. It's like, for the social justice warrior types out there who might be listening, it's like, are you really willing to say that every single person who's accomplished something has done that as a consequence of oppression? That's again what the Soviets claimed with regards to the successful peasants just before the 1920s. It's like, well, the peasants weren't emancipated. They were serfs until about 30 years before that. They were serfs. They were basically slaves. And some of them had clambered up to the point where maybe they owned their hut and a cow and could, employ someone. Well, the Soviet claim was, well, that's all theft. You got that all because you're an oppressor. And so then the Soviet intellectuals went into the villages. And just imagine how this happened. So imagine a village, a small town where everyone knows everybody. And there's maybe 10, 20 people there who are moderately successful. Okay, and so you can imagine that those 20 people have like 100 enemies at the bottom of the socioeconomic distribution. Useless, horrible people who are jealous and resentful about the fact that these people have been successful. Okay, so now the intellectuals come in and say, property is theft, success is oppression. And then they look for the people in the village who are willing to move against those 20 successful people. Well, those guys at the bottom, those 100 resentful, jealous, murderous people at the bottom, they're just waiting for an opportunity to go kick down some doors. And that's exactly what they did in the 1920s. And as I said, they wiped out all their productive peasants. And then 6 million Ukrainians starved to death. They had posters. The Soviets produced posters in the 1930s that said, essentially, don't forget it's wrong to eat your children. So,
whoa.
Yeah, whoa. There's nothing about the there's nothing that you can imagine that's horrible enough so that it matched the reality of what happened in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959.
Why do these patterns repeat themselves? What is it about human beings?
Well, we like things simple. We like things simple. And then you often, like, a simple explanation is a good explanation unless it's too simple. But distinguishing between simple and too simple is no easy matter. We like to know who's our friend and who's our enemy. And we like the feeling of unearned moral superiority. And then
unearned moral superiority.
Yeah,
that's the
why
the
earn it, man? Especially when there's no such thing as earning anyways.
How do you think we got to this point where people are repeating these patterns that were ultimately incredibly unsuccessful and dangerous and deadly in the past, like Marxism, for example? Like, people proudly proclaim themselves as having Marxist ideology.
One in five social scientists claims to be a Marxist.
How do they not understand the history? Well, why don't you fill people in on how that went bad?
Well, the estimates vary, but in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959, somewhere between 30 and 50 million people were killed in internal oppression alone. So that's pretty bad. And then in China, which was operating under exactly the same principles, it might have been up to 100 million killed during Mao's time. And of course, Mao is still revered in China, appallingly enough. And Vietnam and Cambodia, and wherever these ideas were implemented. Well, and then those ideas were put into practice first in the Soviet Union, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, did a very lovely job of detailing in horrifying detail how those initial doctrines were transformed into legislation, and then how those legislation was transformed into endless genocide, essentially, and almost destroyed the world. Let's not forget that. The doctrines, when put into practice, into actual practice, were murderous instantaneously. Now, what happened? There were always apologists for the left in the West, especially in France, especially among the French intellectuals, especially in the late 1960s. And then when all of the information about what was happening in the Soviet Union came flooding forward, and that culminated, say, in about 1973, when Solzhenitsyn's book was published, the French intellectuals changed their tune. Instead of agitating on the part of the working class, which allied them with murderous Marxists, they switched and started to talk about power and to talk about group identity. It was like a sleight of hand. The underlying pathological philosophy remained exactly the same, but the surface nomenclature changed, and that became very attractive. And at the same time, the Soviet Union dissolved. And so one of the problems I think we have now, a perverse problem, is that these Marxist ideas are very attractive to compassionate intellectuals, and we don't have good, bad examples like the Soviet Union around that everybody can point to and go, yeah, well, that sounds good, but, you know, what about the murderous death camps and the millions of people who are suffering? We still have North Korea, but, you know, people treat North Korea like it's a joke instead of like it's an exemplar of a pathological system. And people have no historical memory. Like my students, and that's partly because they're taught so badly in schools, is they have no idea what happened in the Soviet Union. They have absolutely no idea. They know a little bit about the Second World War, maybe. And of course, people generally know about the Holocaust, but they have no idea what happened in the Soviet Union. So they have no idea where these ideas could lead. And the universities and the high schools are so full of people who are radically left-leaning that they're never taught any, the students are never taught any proper history. You know, they're taught about the evils of capitalism. And you know, I mean, it's not like any system is perfect, but there's difference between imperfect and consciously murderous. Now, what I'm trying to show you, I want to show you what it means for someone to be ideologically possessed. And so you can tell when you're talking to someone like that, because this is something I learned from reading Solzhenitsyn, is because you can predict absolutely everything they're going to say. Once you know the algorithmic substructure of their political ideology, which is usually predicated on about 5 or 6 axioms, you can use the axioms to automatically generate speech content. You don't even have to hear the person. You can just predict what they're going to say. And so that alleviates any responsibility whatsoever they have for thinking. And it also allows them to believe that they have full control and full knowledge over not only full control and full knowledge about the entire world, but also the capacity to distinguish without a moment's thought between those who are on the side of the good and those who are not. And that's where the danger really comes. So this is from the Gulag Archipelago. One of my informants has told me how executions were carried out at Adak, a camp on the Pechora River. They would take the opposition members with their things out of the camp compound on a prisoner transport at night, and outside the compound stood the small house of the 3rd section. The condemned men were taken into a room one at a time, and there the camp guards sprang on them. Their mouths were stuffed with something soft, and their arms were bound with cords behind their backs. And see, these were political prisoners who opposed the Soviet system. The condemned men, then they were led out into the courtyard where harnessed carts were waiting. The bound prisoners were piled on the carts from 5 to 7 at a time and driven off to the Gorka, the camp cemetery. On arrival, they were tipped into big pits that had already been prepared and buried alive. Not out of brutality. No. It had been ascertained that when dragging and lifting them, it was much easier to cope with living people than with corpses. The work went on for many nights at Adak, and that is how the moral, political unity of our party was achieved. This is from Viktor Frankl, from his experiences in the Nazi concentration camps. The most ghastly moment of the 24 hours of camp life was the awakening, when, at a still nocturnal hour, the 3 shrill blows of a whistle tore us pitilessly from our exhausted sleep and from the longings in our dreams. We then began the tussle with our wet shoes, into which we could scarcely force our feet, which were swollen and sore with edema. And there were the usual moans and groans about petty troubles, such as the snapping of wires which replaced shoelaces. One morning I heard someone whom I knew to be brave and dignified cry like a child because he finally had to go to the snowy marching grounds in his bare feet, as his shoes were too shrunken for him to wear. In those ghastly moments, I found a little bit of comfort, a small piece of bread which I drew out of my pocket and munched with absorbed delight. From Solzhenitsyn. In cold lower than 60 degrees below zero, work days were written off. In other words, on such days the records showed that the workers had not gone out to work because 60 below was the cutoff for work. But they chased them out anyways, and whatever they squeezed out of them on those days was added to the other days, thereby raising the percentages. And the servile medical section wrote off those who froze to death on such cold days on some other basis. And the ones who were left, who could no longer walk and were straining every sinew to crawl along on all fours on the way back to camp, the convoy simply shot so that they wouldn't escape before they could come back to get them. Solzhenitsyn. Macbeth's self-justifications for his murders were feeble, and his conscience devoured him. Even Iago was a little lamb too. The imagination and spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses. That was because they had no ideology. Ideology. That is what gives evil-doing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social theory, which helps to make this act, his act, seem good instead of bad in his own and others' eyes. That was how the agents of the Inquisition fortified their wills by invoking Christianity, the conquerors of foreign lands by extolling the grandeur of their motherland, the colonizers by civilization, the Nazis by race, and the Jacobins, early and late, by equality, brotherhood, and the happiness of future generations. Without evildoers, there would have been no archipelago. Fire. Fire. The branches crackle, and the night wind of late autumn blows the flame of the bonfire back and forth. The compound is dark. I am alone at the bonfire, and I can bring it still some more carpenter shavings. The compound here is a privileged one, so privileged that it is almost as if I were out in freedom. This is an island of paradise. This is the Marfino Sharashka, a scientific institute staffed with prisoners in its most privileged period. No one is overseeing me, calling me to a cell, chasing me away from the bonfire, and even then it is chilly in the penetrating wind. But she, who has already been standing in the wind for hours, her arms straight down, her head drooping, weeping, then growing numb and still. And then again she begs piteously, "Citizen Chief, please forgive me. I won't do it again." The wind carries her moan to me, just as if she were moaning next to my ear. The citizen chief of the gatehouse fires up his stove and does not answer. This was the gatehouse of the camp next to us, from which workers came into our compound to lay water pipes and to repair the old ramshackle seminary building. Across from me, beyond the artfully intertwined, many-stranded barbed wire barricade, and 2 steps away from the gatehouse, beneath a bright lantern, stood the punished girl, head hanging, the wind tugging at her gray work skirt, her feet growing numb from the cold, a thin scarf over her head. It had been warm during the day when they had been digging a ditch on our territory. And another girl, slipping down into a ravine, had crawled her way to the Vladikino highway and escaped. The guard had bungled, and Moscow city buses ran right along the highway. When they caught on, it was too late to catch her, and they raised the alarm. A mean, dark major arrived and shouted that if they failed to catch the girl, the entire camp would be deprived of visits and parcels for a whole month because of her escape. And the women brigadiers went into a rage, and they were all shouting, one of them in particular, who kept viciously rolling her eyes. "Oh, I hope they catch her, the bitch. I hope they take scissors and clip, 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 take off all her hair in front of the lineup." This wasn't something she had thought up herself. This was the way they punished women in the Gulag. But the girl, who was now standing outside the gatehouse in the cold, had sighed and said instead, "At least she can have a good time out in freedom for all of us." The jailer overheard what she had said, and she was now being punished. Everyone else had been taken off to the camp, but she had been set outside there to stand at attention in front of the gatehouse. This had been at 6 p.m., and now it was 11 p.m. She tried to shift from one foot to another, but the guard stuck out his head and shouted, "Stand at attention, whore, or else it will be worse for you." And now she was not moving, only weeping. "Forgive me, Citizen Chief. Let me into the camp. I won't do it anymore." But even in the camp, no one was about to say to her, "All right, idiot, come on in." The reason they were keeping her out there for so long was that the next day was Sunday, and she would not be needed for work. Such a straw, blonde, naive, uneducated slip of a girl. She'd been imprisoned for some spool of thread. What a dangerous thought you expressed there, little sister. They want to teach you a lesson for the rest of your life. Fire. Fire. We fought the war, and we looked into the bonfires to see what kind of victory it would be. The wind wafted a glowing husk from the bonfire. To that flame in you, girl, I promise, the whole wide world will read about you. Solzhenitsyn describes the reactions and actions of staunch Communist Party members imprisoned and devoured by the system they supported and produced. Frequently, the camp system vacuumed people up, really without any concern whatsoever for the niceties of individual guilt or innocence. As far as Stalin and his henchmen were concerned, there was probably something that you were guilty about at some point in your past, and there were no shortage of people to inform on you, regardless of whether you had done anything. So one of the things that used to happen in the collective apartment buildings, of which there were nowhere near enough of, so multiple families would end up living in the same tiny apartment, was that if you could inform on someone down the hall who maybe refused to return the quarter cup of salt you had lent them or something like that, if you would inform on them and their family would be carted away to the concentration camp system, then you got to have their apartment. And so in East Germany, at the height of the Soviet system, one out of every three people was a government informer. And so that meant if you had a family of 6 people, there were 2 people in every room that you were ever in who were ready to say to the authorities anything you ever had the temerity to speak, and perhaps to tell them all sorts of things that you didn't even do, because there was a requirement, if you were an informer, to ensure that you had something to say every time you came in to inform. Well, it didn't matter if you were a devout communist, because from time to time your door would be kicked down at 3 a.m. in the morning, and people would come in with jackboots and get you dressed as rapidly as they possibly could and take you away when you were still half awake to the prison in the middle of the city and strip you of your clothes and give you things that didn't fit and shave your head and take you off to a camp, and you'd never get to see your family again. And that happened to millions of people. And it happened to staunch communists just like it happened to people who in principle were opposed to the system. And Solzhenitsyn thought that the staunch Communist Party members who were thrown into the camps had the worst time of it of everyone, because the people who'd already decided that the system was corrupt weren't really surprised when it happened, even though it was still terrible. But the Communist Party members had given their whole life to the system, and then they were picked up just like everyone else. And he had a very hard time with them when they came to prison, because most of them assumed that a terrible mistake had been made, and that if they just wrote the right people and contacted their former friends, who would now, by the way, have nothing to do with them, that the error would be rectified and they soon would be released. So they also assumed that everyone else in the camps was completely guilty and was there for good reason, because otherwise the beloved party wouldn't have put them there. But for some reason they had been imprisoned because they were innocent, despite the fact that they were innocent. And Solzhenitsyn and his friends used to play a game with people like that because he didn't exactly know how to treat them, because on the one hand they were victims, certainly, but on the other hand they were part of the system that had perpetrated precisely the horrors that were visited on them. And so when they first came in and were still chock full of communist dogma and totalitarian thought and judgmental in every possible way, him and his friends would have fun pointing out all the shortages and catastrophes of the Soviet system, and then let them run through their algorithmic ideology and to the point of absurdity, and then really not spend much time communicating with them until they broke down and decided that things weren't so good for them or everybody else, and more or less entered the common run of humanity once again. To say that things were hard for them is to say almost nothing. They were incapable of assimilating such a blow, such a downfall, and from their own people too, from their own dear party, and from all appearances for nothing at all. After all, they'd been guilty of nothing as far as the party was concerned. Nothing at all. It was painful for them to such a degree that it was considered taboo among them, uncomradely, to ask, "What were you imprisoned for?" The only squeamish generation of prisoners. The rest of us, with tongues hanging out, couldn't wait to tell the story to every chance newcomer we met and to the whole cell as if it were an anecdote. Here's the sort of people they were. Olga Sliozberg's husband had already been arrested, and they had come to carry out a search and arrest her too. The search lasted 4 hours. And she spent those remaining 4 hours sorting out the minutes of the Congress of Stakhanovites of the bristle and brush industry, of which she had been secretary until the previous day. The incomplete state of the minutes troubled her more than her children, who she was now leaving forever. Even the interrogator conducting the search could not resist telling her, "Come on now, say farewell to your children." Here's the sort of people they were. A letter from her 15-year-old daughter came to Yelizaveta Tsetkova in the Kazan prison for long-term prisoners. "Mama, tell me, write to me, are you guilty or not? I hope you weren't guilty, because then I won't join the Komsomol." So that was the Soviet youth organization. "I won't join the Komsomol, and I won't forgive them because of you. But if you are guilty, I won't write you anymore, and I will hate you." And the mother was stricken by remorse in her damp, grave-like cell with its dim little lamp. How could her daughter live without the Komsomol? How could she be permitted to hate Soviet power? Better that she should hate me. And she wrote, "I am guilty. Enter the Komsomol." How could it be anything but hard? It was more than the human heart could bear to fall beneath the beloved axe and then have to justify its wisdom. But that is the price a man pays for entrusting his God-given soul to human dogma. Even today, any Orthodox communist will affirm that Tsetkova acted correctly. Even today, they cannot be convinced that this is precisely the perversion of small forces, that the mother perverted her daughter and harmed her soul. Here's the sort of people they were. YT gave sincere testimony against her husband, anything to aid the party. Oh, how one could pity them, if at least now they had come to comprehend their former wretchedness. This whole chapter could have been written quite differently if today they had at least forsaken their earlier views. But it happened the way Maria Danielin had dreamed it would. If I leave here someday, I'm going to live as if nothing had taken place. Loyalty. In our view, it is just plain pig-headedness. These devotees to the theory of development construed loyalty to that development to mean renunciation of any personal development whatsoever. As Nikolai Adamovich Vilenchuk said after serving 17 years, "We believed in the party and we were not mistaken." Is this loyalty or pig-headedness? It was not for show and not out of hypocrisy that they argued in the cells in defense of all the government's actions. They needed ideological arguments in order to hold onto a sense of their own rightness. Otherwise, insanity was not far off. I'm going to tell you a story. There's a story in Genesis. It's the last story in Genesis. It's called the Tower of Babel. It's a story, very short story, and it occurs after the story of Noah and the flood. It's an existentialist claim, or maybe it's the existentialist claim, that the conditions of human life are such that suffering is an integral part of existence. Now, it's an important thing to understand. It's also a viewpoint shared by the bulk of the great religious systems of the world. Life is suffering. Why? Well, one reason is because of society's arbitrary judgment, right? Every single one of us has traits and features and quirks and idiosyncrasies that are far from ideal and that are judged by the standards of society as insufficient. And so you suffer because of your imperfect insufficiency in the eyes of others. And you can certainly make the claim that fairly frequently that's arbitrary. And so that's the claim that society is tyrannical and judgmental and needs to be constantly reconstituted so that the tyrannical element doesn't take full control. And fair enough, you have to stay awake so that that doesn't happen. But the thing is, it doesn't matter what society it is, although they vary in the degree of their tyranny. The mere fact that you're grouped together with other people and have to come up with a common value structure in order to live together means that many of the things that characterize you are going to be suboptimal. And so the price you pay for social being is that much of you is deemed insufficient. Now, hopefully there are various ways that you can be within a society that's sufficiently diverse so that you can find a place where what's good about you in the eyes of others and perhaps in your own eyes can flourish of its own accord. Because you don't have to be good at everything. If you can be good at one thing well enough, that might allow you your niche. And hopefully a healthy society allows for that. Certainly societies can become so tyrannical that they don't. So you can lay one source of human suffering at the feet of tyrannical social structures, but the other element of it, clearly, is the mere fact of the arbitrariness of the natural world. Like, you have a lifespan that's going to be counted in the number of decades that you can count on two hands. And that has nothing to do, technically, with the tyranny of the social structure. Now, you could say, if we got our act together more completely, perhaps you could live longer, and fair enough, but the fact of the limits of your lifespan and the suffering that's necessarily a consequence of that, the death of your parents and the death of most people that you will know before you, means that that part of suffering is an integral part of existence itself. And so that can't be laid at the feet of an insufficient social structure except insofar as it's tyrannical and blind. It's a condition of existence. And then by the same token, you have your own responsibility for some of your unnecessary suffering, because there's things you could be doing to make your life better and to make life better for other people that you know perfectly well that you're not doing. And so if you stopped doing all the unnecessary things that make your life bad, then it would improve to some degree that is not really computable, because you don't know how far you could push that. So there's three reasons why you suffer, and one is, well, look at you and the way you're built. It's inevitable. There's not very much of you and there's a lot of everything else. And so you just don't last that long, and you're fragile across multiple domains, and then you're harshly treated by society, and there's no doubt about that. And then there's responsibility that can be laid at your own feet. Well, the existential take on that, and the thing that all these diverse people that we've been talking about, including Viktor Frankl and including Alexander Solzhenitsyn, as well as Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky, and the people that I've already talked to you about, is that the proper pathway through that is to adopt the mode of authentic being. And that is something like refusing to participate in the lie, in deception and the lie, to orient your speech as much as you can towards the truth, and to take responsibility for your own life and perhaps also for the lives of other people. And there's something about that that's meaningful and responsible and noble, but also serves to mitigate the very suffering that produces, say, the nihilism or the flee into the arms of the escape into the arms of totalitarians to begin with. You need something to shelter you against your own vulnerability. And you can adopt a comprehensive description of reality that's formulated for you by someone else that neatly divides the world into those who are innocent and perhaps innocent victims, and those who are guilty and perhaps the perpetrators of the suffering. But none of that has anything to do with you, and in addition, it's simply not a reasonable way of assessing the world. The suffering is built in. What Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really. Really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends. Because that's what happened in the 20th century.